Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. And in today's video we're gonna be talking about Shadow Priest. Now I know I already made a guide in 9.0.5 and technically not too much has changed for Shadow Priest, although there are some changes which I'll be covering as we go along with this video. Outside of that, this video is mostly gonna be about M+. I'll of course give you the talents, the conduits and everything for raiding as well. But this video is mostly gonna be to show you exactly everything you need, including how to use utility, how to do specific things that will get you higher up on the ladder when it comes to Mythic Plus. Because Shadow Priest this season seems to be quite strong, although we are getting nerfed again, so that might come to change. But for now, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, guys. Alright, this section is just to give you guys the talents, especially if you don't particularly need an explanation. You've already played Shadow Priest before and you're not new, you just want to smack the talents down in the game and just play, which is fair enough, to be honest. Here they are. Now I will make a quick mention. Mindbender down here is only if you're playing Prism. If you're playing Talbadar, always go Void Torrent. Now for M+, the build I recommend for most situations is the following. It looks like this. Ancient Madness and Hungering Void both work. They're both really good. So that's just a preference. Just try it out. Misery can also be amazing for some keys. Sacred Nightmare still better for others, like for example DOS and Halls of Atonement. So yeah, here are the builds and I hope you enjoy. Thanks for watching, guys. Alright guys, so first let's start looking at talents as always. So let's start firstly with raiding, the raiding build. So the raiding build hasn't changed that much from last season. There's some changes, especially on the third row, sometimes as well on some of the other rows, but generally speaking, third row tends to be the one that changes the most for raiding. So firstly for raiding, on the first talent row, you will always go Fortress of the Mind. The boss fights I've seen so far, Fortress of the Mind just rules. The extra insanity generation is amazing since you want to be spamming as many Devouring Plagues as you can. And Devouring Plague is basically your entire damage. It's like 30 to 40% of your damage on most boss fights, because there's a lot of single target boss fights this day, although that changes sometimes in Mythic depending to mechanics. Next up we have the second row. For the second row, choose what you will be using, but generally speaking, if you're not sure what to take, I would always go Body and Soul. Body and Soul is amazing because Shadow Priest's biggest weakness to me is firstly lack of defensives and next lack of mobility. We're almost worse than DKs in mobility without this talent. And this talent really allows you to move a bit faster on almost every mechanic you can imagine to dodge, and perhaps grip an ally that won't be able to make it because either they failed the mechanic or they just don't have the mobility to do it. So being able to use Body and Soul just goes well hand to hand with your using Body and Soul goes hand to hand with your utility. Next up, third row. Generally speaking, from all the fights, Twist of Fate has been amazing. That said, fights like Sylvanas and fights like Soul Render, I tend to go Misery. Misery just allows you to put all your dots on all the ads and you get extra value on them, as well as doing some priority damage to the one you need to do. So Soul Render, Sylvanas, fights like this, this talent really shines. Now outside of that, Twist of Fate, which gives you an extra 10% if an enemy that you're dotting or attacking is below 35% of their HP, which basically gives you a execution phase of some sort. And you can also, like for example, dot a small ad with one of your dots, you insta dot Shadow Word Pain to get the bonus of Twist of Fate for the entire duration, which is 8 seconds. Next talent row. Now for raiding, this talent row, generally speaking, tends to be really useless. You rarely get to stun in a raid, you rarely get to kick, and even if there's a kick mechanic, it's not often that a priest is actually required to kick, because you have a lot of other people who have much better kicks than we do. And silence effects are pretty pointless in PvE in general, outside of Mythic Plus of course. So for this one, Last Word or Psychic Horror, whatever you can use, you take it. Otherwise, it doesn't particularly matter, and you probably won't be using any of these anyway. Next row, we have Auspicious Spirits and Shadow Crash as the main two options for this tier. Psychic Lake has seen some use in M+ as well, but we'll come to that in a second. First, the Auspicious Spirits. Your shadowy apparition now deal 15% increased damage and generate 2 insanity. This is just amazing, especially on Soul Render, where you get to really see a lot of spirits go out and give you insanity back, as well as deal a bunch of damage. That said, even on single target or on the Eye of the Jailer, you get a lot of value out of this talent. Shadow Crash, I've seen some people using it on Fate Scribe, I've seen some people use it on Sylvanas. It sees a lot of potential, but generally speaking, it's a niche one, and although it can be really good for logs, it's not always the best choice to go for. That said, some bosses, it can be the best choice, and we have yet to see what the best choices are for each boss. But generally speaking, I would go Suspicious Spirits if you're not sure. Next row is really dependent on what legendary you're running. So if you're using the Shadow Flame Prism, which a lot of people are and most Covenants are, then you will be using Mindbender 100% of the time for single target, 100% of the time for AoE, 100% of the time for M+. Although, if you're using Stratagem, that changes and you play Void Torrent every time, because Void Torrent does a bunch of damage and it generates a lot of insanity. But generally speaking, a lot of people don't go for Stratagem anymore, so Mindbender tends to be the pick. Last talent row, we have Ancient Madness, Hungry Void, Surrender to Madness. Now, we all know we want to play Surrender to Madness, but we don't get to, so it's sad, yeah. But Hungry Void, that's just the choice right now that we have. It's just the best one out of all of them. It gives you 10% increased damage with your Void Bolt, and you get to stay in Void form for as long as you can, which is just amazing because all our damage is practically done in Void form. And yeah, that's really our burst, and we get to have it more if we play Night Fae. We don't if we play the other Covenants, but your Void form is where you do damage, so that doesn't matter. Ancient Madness, I actually saw a lot of play last season compared to what I thought it would, but not anymore. I haven't seen that many people play with Ancient Madness outside of maybe some PvP niche plays, but outside of that, for raiding, Hungry Void is your 100% pick, and I wouldn't change it unless there's a new build that comes out or something. But for now, these are the talents I would run for almost every boss fight, outside of maybe changing it to Misery if it's Surrender or Sylvanas, heavy AoE fights, or heavy AD fights that are not together because you want to dot as fast as you can. So that's it for the raiding. Alright, next up we're going to be talking about M+ builds. Now there's a lot more choice for M+ than there is for single target. Some dungeons are even having their own builds like Fate of Pain, which is quite a pain as a Shadow Priest depending on what comps you're playing. Anyway, without further ado, let's start with it. On the first row, you have two options. You can forget Unfurling Darkness, it is completely worthless in dungeons so far. That might come to change in the future, but for now, Death and Madness and Fortress of the Mind are the only two options we have. Fortress of the Mind is just an overall best single target choice, and for some tyrannical bosses, and depending on the comp you're playing, it can be a really good choice. As for Death and Madness, it just goes hand to hand with the legendary you'll most likely be using, which is Prism. If a target dies within 7 seconds after being struck by your Shadow Word Death, you gain 40 insanity over 4 seconds, and the cooldown of your execute is reset. This is huge, it does a lot of damage if you can time it well, and you get a lot of insanity generation, often too much. But it's still amazing for single target, and I tend to go for Death and Madness even though it's a tyrannical week. Next row we have two choices mostly. All three are good, but two of the choices in this row are particularly good, especially because it's the start of season. Body and Soul overall, and later in the season, and now as well, is overall the best choice. Now, for really high push keys, the best choice is Intangibility, because we lack gear right now. Getting one shot in an 18 is something that happens quite often actually, and even in the 16 and 17, let's say the first pack Inspires, and you double pack, if you get sniped by two of the casters, well, you just die. So Intangibility allows you to use Disperse 30-second, like with a 30-second reduced cooldown on it, and also some extra healing, which is just useful. But overall, if you're not sure, you're just doing, you know, your plus 10s, your plus 15s, and you're trying to get all plus 15s, Body and Soul is just the way to go, and for a majority of things, Body and Soul is always the way to go. But I just wanted to mention Intangibility. Sand Lane is for niche plays, and if your healer needs help on a specific boss or something. Next row, we have two options. Twist of Fate is a no-go most of the time. Some people try it sometimes in dungeons like Fate of Pain, but generally speaking, it's really tough to pull out. You waste a lot of time dotting enemies, and you lose damage overall. So it's not worth it. Misery is part of one of the builds, which is the 5 to 6 mob kind of build. Searing Nightmare is the one that you tend to use for big AoE, like Halls of Atonement, where you usually pull really big, or DOS, where you also pull really big. Mist of Turner Scythe can be also really good. There's a lot of dungeons. Searing Nightmare is the most favorite one. But for other dungeons like Fate of Pain, Spires, sometimes even Mist, Misery can be great. Next up, we have the utility row. So here the biggest problem is really dependent on whether you have good silent kicks in your group. So let's say for example you have a shaman healer and you have 2 melees. Well, kicks shouldn't be a problem. Generally speaking, you shouldn't have a problem with kicks. You have like 4 really short cooldown kicks. But let's say for example you're playing with a mage and a moonkin. Well, Last Word might actually be good. Psychic Aura, usually the go-to choice, but Last Word can see play as well. Mind Bomb, not really, because Fae is already really good as it is, so Mind Bomb tends to be kind of lackluster out of the 3. Next up, we have 2 choices once again. Auspicious Spirits, Shadow Crash. Psychic Link is more of a niche play again, and doesn't really see that much play compared to the other 2. Auspicious Spirits. Your Shadowy Apparition now deal 15% increased damage and generate 2% insanity. This talent will see a lot more play as the expansion goes on. The reason for this is, as our crit increases, the chance of critting and getting 2 auspicious spirits, two spirits every time you crit is more likely. So this will only become stronger as the patch goes on and as the expansion goes on overall, like it always has. Shadow Crash overall on big AoE after you go into Void Form is just insane. Big burst damage, just amazing. I tend to go Shadow Crash. Some dungeons like Fader, Auspicious Spirits is great, but still Shadow Crash for like all the others is practically the best. Next talent row, we have 2 options depending on what Covenant and what Legendary you're playing. So if you're playing Talbadar, Void Torrent. If you're playing like most people, Prism, Mindbender. Simple choice, only possible choice for you. Last row, all 3 see play here. Now, Surrender to Madness doesn't see as much play, and it's more of a niche pick, and you'll know if you want to use it. It's more of a I need a second Void Form exactly at this time kind of thing, as well as the extra insanity generation, and you have to be kind of used to playing that talent because it can be pretty dangerous, you know. You don't want to pop it on a full health boss and just die. Yeah, that happened at some point to me as well, don't worry. Ancient Madness. Ancient Madness, after playing with it a lot actually yesterday, I feel like Ancient Madness in most keys is just insane. The damage it gives you is over the charts, especially with the build I have right now. Searing Nightmare, Shadow Crash, Mindbender, Death and Madness. Ancient Madness, just like last season, is my favorite, but if you need more single target, because I know it is a tyrannical week still, and for dungeons like Fader with its 5 bosses, Hungering Void is amazing. So Hungering and Ancient Madness are really good choices overall. If you're going Misery, you usually will go Hungering Void. If you go Searing Nightmare, Ancient Madness is recommended, but that's just a personal preference for me. Alright guys, next up, let's talk Legendaries. Now Legendaries for Shadow Priest, there's quite a few choices. One of them right now is very prominent. The other ones tend to be other options if you don't particularly like playing with Prism specifically, which is the one you're going to be running in most cases. However, if you're feeling a bit adventurous and you will want to swap Covenants from Night Fae or Ven Fae, Necrolord is looking pretty good with the new legendary palette command. Now, we've yet to see how good this is going to be, and from what we can see, Night Fae is still going to be at the top of the ladder when it comes to M+. So I'd still recommend staying with Prism, but for raiding, palette command is probably going to take over. Potentially for Mythic, next week we'll have to see the logs, etc. And I'll try to make a video on that. The other options, we have Twins of the Priestess Sun. Now this one simply allows you to put a PI on someone else and get it on yourself. It can be good for coordinated groups at high Mythic Keystones, and perhaps coordinated tactics or niche plays and that kind of thing. Can be good for that. But I'd still recommend the other options. Another one to keep in mind is Talbadar, but Talbadar has been nerfed as well, and Prism is still looking to be in the lead, and no one is playing the Covenants that you should be playing Talbadar on. So overall, make Prism, play Prism, but keep in mind that Palette Command might be really good, specifically for raiding, maybe for M+, we have yet to see, and I'll try to make a video when it comes out. I think it's next week or the week after, whatever. Anyway, that's it for Legendaries. Covenants. Now, for Covenants, there's only two good choices right now when it comes to raiding and dungeons. The other two can be played as well, but you'll see a major difference in DPS overall. So these two choices, firstly, Night Fae is a safe guarantee that you'll do the maximum damage you can right now. The next one is Necrolord. Now Necrolord's new legendary is going to be the main reason for it, but Necrolord is looking pretty good even with the trace, the soulbinds, especially with the Aime, what it's getting, etc., which is really good. As for the other Covenants, Ven Fae is the worst one out of all of them, at least for PvE. We all know PvP, it's the master one, and if you want to do PvP and PvE, well, sadness for you, I guess. But on another point, Kyrian is looking pretty decent, better than it was at least last season. Still under the other two I've mentioned before, which are Necrolord and Night Fae, but we can see some potential of it being at least a bit better than it was last season, which was pretty much non-existent, and under Ven Fae as well. Alright guys, now let's talk Conduits. What conduit should you use? Is it affected by what Covenant you are? Not really. Aside, there's only one Covenant you should be using the conduit from that specific Covenant, and that's Kyrian, which affects only a minority of Shadow Priests. As for the rest, generally, Dissonant Echoes, which resets your Void Bolt, has a chance to reset your Void Bolt cooldown, which goes hand to hand with your Hungering Void talent, is mostly for single targets. Doesn't see much play outside of maybe Theta, Fate of Pain, Mythic Plus wise. Outside of that, you don't particularly play with this one, but for raiding, it's insane. For Theta, it's insane, so having it is always useful. When it comes to your second option for potency, we have Haunting Apparition. Shadowy apparitions deal 50% increased damage. Now, this is affected by the item level, a bit like the chance with the Dissonant Echoes. But it's really strong, increases your apparition damage, and overall increases your damage by quite a bit, which is nice because Shadowy Apparition do quite a bit of damage in M+, and single target as well in raid. So this will be your best option for both on equal grounds, but Dissonant Echoes for single target is insane. Next up we have Rabid Shadows. Attack speed increased by 30% on your Mindbender. Now, this is really good if you're playing Mindbender and you're playing Prism. because you're gonna be playing Mindbender only if you're playing Prism, otherwise you'll be playing Void Torrent, right? So if you're playing Mindbender, this is insane. Your Mindbender will actually do insane amount of damage, generate a lot more insanity during its duration as well, and overall giving you some nice increased damage. That's it for the potency. The other options don't particularly see play outside of the Carrion specific potency conduit. Next up we have Endurance Conduits. Translucent Image, that is your first pick. It basically increases it makes it so your Fade reduces the damage you take by a certain amount depending on item level. So it's around, I think it's at around 9%, if I remember correctly, depending if your item level is 226 or not. Next up we have Light's Inspiration. Desperate Prayer heals 10% of your health over 5 seconds. Nothing too major, but considering we lack defensive, this is a really nice option, and overall you'll be using Desperate Prayer almost on cooldown in dungeons and raid. So this is a great option for that. When it comes to Finesse, we don't particularly prefer one over others. The one that decreases the amount of mana you need to use for Dispelling, Purging, and Mass Dispelling is the one I usually go for. But the other options are also great depending on your playstyle, so I'd recommend you try all of them when it comes to Finesse. For the others, those are your 5 best options, and you'll be using them a majority of the time, with only one Finesse conduit available to you, so that's a bit more of your choice. Alright, next up, let's talk a bit about stats. Now, stats haven't changed too much from last season. Haste will still be your major stats, followed by crit / mastery. Now, for raiding, 100% mastery is the second stat. For dungeons, if we're talking fortified, I actually think crit might slowly start to take over. And the reason for this is quite simply that Devouring Plague is getting nerfed, and with Devouring Plague nerfed, maybe Shadowy Apparition is slowly gonna start to take over, and crit might actually become more reliant. Now, I think this is more of a change that's gonna occur probably in the future patches of Shadowlands, because so far Devouring Plague still does a lot of damage, and overall the trade between your crit and Mastery is probably still your best second choice, even for AoE, because of how much damage you gain in Void Form, especially if you're playing Night Fae. It's still debatable a bit for Necrolord and the other Covenants. For Night Fae, Mastery second stat confirmed. For Necrolord, still Mastery confirmed, to be honest, but crit, have some crits, and maybe in the future we get to see some change in the stats, because Mastery has been quite prominent last season, and is probably going to stay that way for this season as well. Followed, of course, with Versatility. Have a few % of it if eye level forces you to, which is not bad, because you're going to take more damage now than you will in a few months when you actually have 252 eye level or whatever the max item level cap is. So yeah, that's it for stats. Alright guys, for the last part of this video, I want to talk a bit about Shadow Priest's utility. I want to talk about things to know about Shadow Priest and what's changed from last season. So, for the first thing, I'm going to talk about Night Fae players. Night Fae, you need to keep in mind there's no Pride anymore, so you have to use your Night Fae ability at the right time to get your Void Form back at the time you wish to have it. So let's say, for example, you have a pretty chunky pack right now, you want to use one Void Form with PI and everything, but you also have a decently chunky pack a bit afterwards. You need to make sure that you use Night Fae at the right times to get your Void Form back and get as much damage as you can, or for priority targets. Overall, for Shadow Priest, not much has changed. The gameplay is still the same. Priorities with Mindbender and using Prism still the same as well. Your gameplay is not going to really change. You're still going to be wanting to pop your Mindbender on both Void Eruptions if you're playing Night Fae, and you're going to want to use Mindbender and Unholy Nova together if you're playing Necrolords, if you don't have all your cooldowns, so Void Form, PI, and your Trinket, which hopefully should be Ruby for majority of the things. I'm suffering because I still don't have a new Ruby, and I've been grinding for it, but that's the thing. So, other things to keep in mind. So, Shadow Priests right now are especially strong because you have a lot of support you can give to the team. One of the ones that I feel like is really underrated when I see a fellow Shadow Priest is Leap of Faith. Leap of Faith is huge. You can, using Leap of Faith on cooldown just to make your healer go a bit faster, or the person in your team that's a bit slower than you go faster, is gonna be at least a few seconds per dungeon that you're gonna win, which is something to keep in mind. Next, PI. Let's say you don't have your cooldowns. Void Eruption is on cooldown, Mindbender or something like that, or you Trinket, or you messed up your timings, whatever man, name it. PI you can use on someone else to make sure that you time the key. So you can use it on the DKU part, for example, who's just using Army or something like that, right? So those are things to keep in mind. The last thing I want to talk about is Master Spell and Shackle Undead. Now, Master Spell is very important. It can be used in so many ways, it's insane. Master Spell can remove bursting, it can remove a lot of debuffs, or it can remove a lot of dots. For example, in the new affix, there's this guy who does a lot of flames. Honestly, I can't remember his name. He has this flame aura and puts dots on everyone. Once you see like your team has like 3 to 4 dots, Master Spell is gonna make a huge difference in how much your healer is gonna have to input mana or cooldowns on the fight. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The next one is Shackle Undead. Shackle Undead is underrated. Shackle Undead can stop a lot of things. Let's say you don't have a kick. You're in Fate of Pain, you don't have no one has a kick, and this Necromancer is casting. Shackle Undead can literally save your group. Same with stun, but if you don't, let's say you have nothing, which does actually happen quite often, Shackle Undead can just give you enough time to get your kickback or someone else's kickback, which is just mad. The last thing I actually want to mention, last, is Vampiric Embrace. Vampiric Embrace is insane. Let's say your healer just dies, and you're on this pack, and your tank doesn't particularly have many cooldowns. Vampiric Embrace can really save the entire group. So those are just some notes to keep you informed. Not much has changed from my last video, and I'll try to make a new video about Palette Command, the new Legendary. But outside of that, guys, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.